1946, Oregon
quit their claim to the Oregon Territory. During the Mexican War, we forced them to sell us this big, large chunk of land on which we are sitting right now. And then a few years later, the Gadsden Purchase was finalized to kind of bring together most of the land that is now within the United States. And every time this happened, the lands would go through a process of first becoming a territory, and then as the territory grew and people moved into the territory and businesses started to become established, then they would become a state. And the US Congress would pass legislation that would enable them to be a state, an enabling act. Certainly that's what happened with Arizona and New Mexico. With the federal lands, back then, the General Land Office, which is now the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, but it started out being the General Land Office. At territory time, they gave the state Section 16 and 36 from each township in the state to help pay for the schools for the growing state. And if those townships were occupied by some land that they might have given to an Indian reservation or something like that, then the state would select another section. And then at statehood, the same thing happened, except we got 2 more sections from every township, and these all were transferred into the school trust. And so the school trust is a large fund of money. It's over $1 billion, and money that is made off of these lands in one way or another goes into the school trust to fund schools, universities, I think a penitentiary, things like that. Initially, these lands, they were all kind of scattered around. Nobody really put much thought into how these things should be arranged. And this caused problems in management and use. Later on, these lands were consolidated through exchanges with private individuals and with federal agencies. And that has kind of come and gone. Let's see, so management of state trust is, or at least the state trust system, the way it's set up is, it's placed both in the state constitution and it's also in the Federal Enabling Act for Arizona and New Mexico. So any changes in the way, well, a lot of changes that you would make in the way school trust lands are managed, quite often you have to change both the state constitution and the Federal Enabling Act. Now this is a big deal. You know, just passing a law is not all that hard. You just have to get, you know, more than 50% of the vote. But to change the Constitution, you need, I think, 2/3 of the vote, or a voter initiative. Plus then you have to talk Congress into making the appropriate changes at the congressional level. And that probably wouldn't be very hard. I think whatever the state decided, Congress would go along with. In the state constitution, they say that trust lands are managed for the highest and best value. This trust is a perpetual intergenerational trust to support primarily public schools. And it's managed largely for revenue through grazing, agriculture. There's some farmlands that are irrigated, like near Maricopa, I know of, that are state trust lands. Real estate development, not just commercial leases like the festival that's out there on the Renaissance Festival. That is a commercial lease of state land. But also, state land can be sold for development, and that's how they've actually made a lot of their money. As for the western states that have state trust lands, Arizona's probably got a school trust that is in much better shape than the other states because they've been selling so much land for urban development when that land is at its highest value. But they also have oil and gas and mineral leases. Here's our famous Governor George W.P. Hunt in 1914 with some of the first members of the State Land Commission. So this is the mission of the State Land Department, and I took this from their annual report. And some of this, I mean, frankly, after having dealt with the State Land Department for a long time, it just, maybe they've changed, but it just doesn't seem to fit their culture. To manage state trust lands and resources to enhance value and optimize economic return for the trust, beneficiaries consistent with sound stewardship, conservation, and business management principles supporting socioeconomic goals for citizens here today and generations to come. To manage and provide support for resource conservation programs for the well-being of the public and the state's natural environment. They do other things besides manage the school trust. They have some involvement with the NRCDs. This is the current arrangement of surface lands in the state nowadays. The blue lands are school trust lands, state lands. The yellow lands are Bureau of Land Management lands. They're mostly lands that the General Land Office never got around to disposing of, and so that's what they own now. And a lot of those lands have a lot of mineral value because that's one of the main missions of the BLM. You know, a Bureau of Land, Livestock and Mining, they do the mining. A lot of these lands have exposed bedrock, mountain ranges and things like that. Through a lot of the exchanges, the State Land Department consolidated a lot of their ownership. Some of the lands along the I-17 corridor where the Agua Fria National Monument is, that used to be state trust land, and they did some land exchanges to consolidate that and get that set up. So now that is BLM land, where we have the Agua Fria Monument. So nowadays, a lot of the state trust land is in alluvial fan valleys between the mountain ranges. A lot of the mountain ranges in southern Arizona are Forest Service lands. They're in lands in the Phoenix metropolitan area, in the corridor between Tucson and Phoenix, and then up here around Prescott too. A lot of lands, when the railroads were being built, the railroads, as incentive for them to build these roads, they were given every other section of land. And so up here we have what's called, checkerboarding, where every other section of land is state land or private land. And the private land was probably originally railroad land that has since been sold to private owners, and those private owners are mostly ranchers, and so they also lease the state land next door. And of course, Arizona has a very small amount of private land, only 17.5%. That's a lot more than Nevada. Nevada's down there in like the 11% area. But a lot of Arizona, 27.6 is Indian trust land, 42.2 is federal, and 12.7 is state trust land. So it's a big, big part of the state. State trust lands are not public lands. A lot of the federal laws that govern public lands, Forest Service and BLM lands, don't apply. NEPA does not apply. A lot of things in the Endangered Species Act wouldn't apply because they're not a federal agency. Federal Land Policy Management Act doesn't apply. Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act doesn't apply. These are kind of standard natural resource laws, but they don't apply. Even recreational use on state trust land is not legal unless you either have a hunting license and you're hunting out there, or you get a recreational permit. So this is a map showing density of livestock, cows per section going from the east to the west. And we're out here. You can just barely see us because the carrying capacity for cattle out here is so low. Maricopa County, I think, is a lot higher because we have irrigated pastures here in Maricopa County. This is cattle density, number of head per kilometer squared. Most of Arizona is below 5. Some areas, according to the study, were rated as not being able to support cattle at all. These are the beneficiaries of the permanent fund of the school trust. These are the places that get the money, and it's set up for normal schools. And don't ask me what a normal school is compared to a common school. I think a normal school was like maybe Arizona State University Teachers College, I guess might have been a normal school. Common schools, I think, are kindergarten through 12. Agricultural mechanical colleges, military institutes. I'm not sure what military institute we have here, but School of Mines, University Land Code, University of Arizona, Act of 1881, School for the Deaf and Blind in Tucson, and various other things. But the big one here is the normal schools, or I'm sorry, the common schools. That's a big beneficiary. Okay, so these are leases. They get money from a lot of other things too, like sales of land for development, but this is from the annual report last year. And let's see, grazing leases, that's the big one here. And 8,378,000 acres is about that, and the annual receipts are about $2.5 million. So I was meaning to look up the budget for public schools, kindergarten through 12th grade the other day and include this in here. I neglected that, but I'm sure it's a little bit over $2 million a year. So this is really a small part of but it's a lot of land. So a lot of land is being grazed for the purpose of only providing $2 million to the school trust per year. So they set numbers just like on Forest Service and public lands through range surveys. They use things like the Parker three-step. They rate the pastures as being poor, fair, stable, poor, stable, or whatever. This is from, I think this is the mill site allotment. I think that's Forest Service allotment, if I'm not mistaken. Just so you know, forage consumed by one cow in 1 month is called a 1 AUM, 1 animal unit month. And one cow, if it's on the land for a whole year, it's going to consume 12 AUMs. So that's an animal unit month. That's how much this cow would eat in a month. And that's the way the fees are calculated. There's equivalency because some animals weigh more and consume more, and some weigh less and consume less. Actually, on this chart here, they don't really show a 1.0 cow, but they do show a cow and a calf is 1.35 animal units. Mature mule deer is 0.23. A sheep, doe, and a kid pair, 0.24. But this is one way they calculate the fees on public lands and state trust lands. This is complicated, but just know that there is a formula for calculating out the fees on state trust land. These are, again, from the annual report. These are fees going from 1996 to 2012 over here. And the fees in 1996 were $2.18 per AUM. For one cow, multiply that by 12, for a year. The fee in 2012 is $2.41 an AUM. This is a chart showing, let's see, I'm going to have to walk away just to be able to read this little thing here. This is the change in inflation from about 1980 until the present time, and this is the percent change in a postage stamp cost. So that's inflation of a postage stamp, and you'll notice that there's a big difference between that rate of inflation and the rate of inflation of the AUM fee. So it's not, I'm not sure why it's done this way. I think that on public lands, the same thing would apply. I think usually the AUM cost is on federal lands is kind of in that same neighborhood. Some of you might know better than me, but I think it. $1.35, okay. So this is an example, and I just drew this up, a theoretical example. One report I saw about grazing in Pima County showed that the carrying capacity of lands in Pima County were from 1 to 20 cows per section, 640 acres. So let's assume kind of an average taken from right in the middle of that spread, a capacity of 10 cows per section, So we have a 20,000 acre lease. Let's say all of that lease was able to be grazed. None of it's up in the mountains or anything, or it's too steep or too rocky. That would be 312 cows. You multiply 312 cows times 12 months. That means you're going to have to pay 3,704 animal unit months per year at a fee of $2.40. It's actually $2.41, but oh well. At a fee of $2.40 per AUM, the yearly lease would cost $8,985 annually. Also, improvements are the responsibility of the lessee. When the lessee gives up his lease, the new person coming in has to buy their improvements. So they don't go with the land. They belong to the permittee that has that land. And so, but I was just thinking, oh my God, this guy is renting 2,000 acres for his livestock at about $9,000 a year. I pay over $20,000 per year on my loan, house loan, for 1.5 acres. So, I'm just saying. Am I a sucker? I just follow the system. I'm just a sheep. There's no public review of state grazing leases. There's no NEPA. There's no process for doing that. There is an MOU between Arizona Game and Fish Department and the State Land Department. And in that, one of the important components is they're supposed to let the Game and Fish Department review their actions. And well, I started noticing the only things we were getting from them were, you know, like a little notice of them putting in a fence line or a stock tank. And so I called them up and talked to Steve Williams, and I said, well, you know, we really like to review the meat of the matter, you know, your leases. And they said, well, we don't really have time for that. And so I said, well, we'll make time. You know, you just send them to us. And he said, well, you just have your Bob Broscheid talk to our guy next time they have their annual coordination meeting. And then I learned they weren't even having their annual coordination meetings anymore. So frankly, things might have changed. It's been a few years since I've been involved in this, but there is sometimes where you have mixed land ownings where the rancher is leasing Forest Service land, maybe even BLM land and state trust land. They'll do coordinated resource management plan. And in that process, there's some public scoping. So that is a way that there might be public scoping on state trust land. But otherwise, so a lot of people, at least during the years that I've been working in this area, have certainly started to really started to notice that state trust land in a lot of places were in really bad shape. It's interesting, you can almost tell that it's state trust land when you're driving by at 70 miles an hour. That must be state trust land. And once I got kind of upset, I was a student, this was like 1980, and I saw that the land at the southwest corner of Carefree Highway and I-17, which is now across from Ben Avery Shooting Range, was in really, really bad shape. It was like this. It was just bare ground, rocks, and some scraggly Palo Verde trees, maybe a few creosote. And I got motivated, and I called the State Land Department, and I complained to somebody, probably Steve Williams. And he said, well, it doesn't really matter because all that land is going to be sold for development anyway, is what he told me. Now, this is 36 years ago, so. But anyway, that land is still open space, and it's still in bad shape. So, you know, without a public process, people, conservationists started to wonder, how can we deal with this? Could trust land be leased for wildlife and not grazing? That seems to make sense, right? You know, you could lease some, pick up somebody's grazing lease and then rest it, use it for quail or something like that. Or could the laws restricting use of trust land for extractive purposes be changed? So there was a real key court case in 2001. Forest guardians went to court with the State Land Department after the land agency refused to grant them a grazing lease for conservation. The state Supreme Court, went to the state Supreme Court, ruled that the State Land Department must award grazing leases to the highest and best bidder, even if the plan is to keep cows off the land, letting it lie fallow instead of grazing it. And so since this went to the state Supreme Court, this is now case law. Now this is another thing. This one is ongoing in the courts right now. The Arizona Court of Appeals has rejected, this was July 6th this year, has rejected a constitutional challenge to the legality of procedures used by the Land Department to determine who gets to lease state land for grazing. The judges rejected Wild Earth Guardian's arguments that the Land Department ignored a constitutional requirement that the leasing of public lands be made to the highest and best bidder at public auction. So now the case involves over 6,000 acres near Springerville that was coming up for lease renewal. Before the lease expired, Wild Earth filed an application to lease the same land, not to graze animals, but to let it rest. But that conflict required the State Land Department to ask each applicant to submit information for it to determine which had the highest and best bid. So State Land Department determined the previous lessee had a superior offer, even outweighing Wild Earth's offer of additional rent. State Land Department stated the law allows the land commissioner not to take bids if one bidder's right or equity on the lease outweighs an offer of additional rent. So the implication is here, and I don't know their policies inside and out, but the implication here that I see is that they're giving preferential treatment to the lessee that already is there in place. And so that, in spite of the previous court case, that is letting the State Land Department, it's allowing them to not take Wild Earth Guardian's offer of a bid. And this is on appeal right now. So you know, over the years, I remember a lot of voter initiatives coming and going for state land reform. The one thing that did pass was in 1996, the Arizona Preserve Initiative passed, and this sets aside state trust lands from sale if wanted by a municipality. And so during that time, some developer couldn't bid on those lands, and then when the municipality has the money, they can then buy those lands from the school trust. And this has happened in Scottsdale. That's how they got most of the McDowell-Sonoran Preserve, and a lot of that land had been state trust land. In 2000, Proposition 100 would have amended the Constitution by conserving 270,000 acres of school trust land and allowed direct transfer of trust lands to school districts without compensation. This one failed. In 2006, there were two competing propositions. Okay, so this Proposition 106 was the conservation proposition, and it proposed a constitutional amendment to allow creation of 694,000 acres of trust land. I remember sitting in the office going through maps and trying to identify recommendations the Game and Fish Department had for lands. And that one failed, but it failed because the opponents put forth a competing initiative. And so they're essentially splitting the ticket, and they're giving voters what looks like a choice between two proposals. Rather, I mean, you could vote yes on both of them, but people were confused. And so both of them failed, which was the objective of the non-conservation oriented people here. There we are. Trust land exchanges. From a conservation standpoint, this is really important because, first of all, having isolated little parcels of land is very hard to manage. Also, if you can exchange lands, maybe there's lands of really important historical value that could go to the feds, and maybe in exchange the state could pick up lands that had a lot of grazing value. So a number of efforts were made. In 1936, Congress amended the Enabling Act to allow more flexibility in exchanges, and so then exchanges started going on. In 1990, the Center for Law and the Public Interest sued the state land department and said land exchanges were contrary to the state constitution because they did not involve an auction. So they're basically giving away land or exchanging it without an appraisal or an auction. I don't know if appraisal was done, and that prevailed at the Supreme Court. So now they're back to no exchanges. So 1990, they voted, we had an initiative to change the Constitution to allow for exchanges, and that failed. 1992, same thing, failed. 1994, same thing, failed. 2002, failed. 2004, failed. 2012, it finally passed. So I think a lot of Arizonans were skeptical of what was going on here, but in 2012, conservation groups were on record as supporting it. They gave the pro argument in the book. I just threw this in, Superstition Vistas. It really has nothing to do with grazing except it's being grazed now. And it is all of this state trust land that's in the Southeast Valley here, east of Queen Creek. It's a big chunk of land, 275 square miles. And they've been working on an urban plan to kind of manage this and develop it and plan it the right way, as if all the planning up to this point has been done the wrong way. But anyway, in any case, they want to put 1 million people out there, so that'll take care of the grazing issues. So.